if you have bled support to restore, is it not a case of trying to put egos aside and then come together, and then your party could gain some momentum again?
I sometimes feel it might be difficult for Mr. Lowe to put an ego aside because I'm not entirely sure what else is there. However,
as I say, that's a no. Then
there are many good people who have clustered around Mr. Lowe and Restore, and we'd be only too happy to have them back. Of course we would.
Now, could there be some kind of grand alliance on the more radical right of UK politics between Reform UK and Restore Britain? For those who may not have heard of the latter, it's the creation of Rupert Lowe. He's the former Reform MP who fell out pretty badly with Nigel Farage and the rest of the party not too long after he was elected. Now, Mr Farage has acknowledged this week that Restore was eating into his party's vote share after Restore got 9% of the vote in the Greater Manchester mayoral election, beating both the Conservatives and the Lib Dems. On social media, where a lot of this debate does seem to take place, Mr Lowe seemingly offered a truce and suggests the parties should come together. But there's been tit for tat between the two, between Restore and Reform, about whether this is a real offer. And some of Restore's requirements for a pact are pretty punchy, including preventing Tory ministers from being in a future cabinet, banning the burqa and halal meat, and a referendum on the death penalty. Well, let's bring in two people who know what they're talking about on this. Gawain Towler, who is a Reform UK board member and long-time sidekick to Nigel Farage, and Sir John Curtice, the Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and the nation's favourite polling guru. Hello, Gawain and Sir John. Good to have you with us.
Good afternoon.
Right, let's start, John, with you and that point about the Greater Manchester mayoral election. When I saw that Restore had got 8%, my eyebrows certainly raised. This was a very unusual election with a low turnout, a lot of focus on Bev Craig, Labour's candidate, who won. But 8% seems quite a lot for a party that seemed to chiefly exist on Twitter.
True, though it was a result that was fully anticipated by the 2 or 3 opinion polls that were done beforehand, all of which reckoned that Restore Britain were going to get between 8 or 9% in that by-election. I think, in fairness, they probably picked a rather effective candidate who was well known for some of her campaigning. Well, the truth is we don't know a great deal about Restore Britain's standing, beyond the circumstances of the 2 by-elections, the one in Greater Manchester and the one in Makerfield, where they got 7% of the vote that they actually fought. Only 3 companies have started to incorporate, including Restore Britain as part of their standard tap relations and one of the parties that's offered to people. One is YouGov. They've been doing it since the beginning of April. They have been consistently getting about 3 to 4% support registered for Restore Britain. Ipsos, in the one poll where they've done it, which was at the back end of June, they also got 3%. On the other hand, Surveillance have actually now done it 2 or 3 times, and they've only got between 1 and 2%. So exactly how popular the party is across the country as a whole is uncertain. But those are the best estimates we have so far, and given that the polls actually anticipated Restore Britain's strength in Makerfield and Greater Manchester, there's no particular reason to believe that these polls are underestimating Restore Britain's support across the country as a whole. If you look at the innards, while there are some ways in which it's quite clear that Restore Britain are primarily taking votes off Reform, certainly the tabulations that enable you to look at, who are people voting for now as compared with what they did in 2024. You've got, at least according to YouGov and similarly for Ipsos, about 1 in 10 of those people who voted for Reform in 2024. There are a few people who voted Tory and Labour, but certainly the implication of that is that probably not only is it the case that some people who voted for Reform in 2024 are now voting for back in Restore Britain, but also are some of those who moved to Reform between 2024 and the height of Reform support this year. But the interesting thing is, if you look at the demographics of Restore Britain's support, it doesn't look like that for Reform. In particular, Reform voters tend to be much stronger amongst older voters than amongst younger voters. That is not true of Restore Britain. Indeed, also, Restore Britain almost seemed to be almost as popular amongst women as it is amongst men. That, again, distinguishes it from Reform. Now, quite why Restore Britain are apparently able to reach sections of the electorate that reform apparently don't find it so easy to reach, I think at the moment is one of those fascinating puzzles to which we don't know the answer.
Well, Gawain, Nigel Farage has clearly got Restore on the brain at the moment, since when he gave his press conference talking about the small boats crisis and how to tackle it earlier this week. He was asked about this and said, they could see some kind of coming together. So is your sense, first of all, is Reform worried about this? And why don't you all just come together?
A couple of things. Firstly, I don't think he's got Restore on the brain. However, if somebody asked him a direct question, he's going to answer it. That doesn't mean he's got it on the brain. However, look, I mean, there are most of the people that Restore have, for example, their councillors are people who are elected as Reform. Almost all of them, apart from a handful elected under a different name in Great Yarmouth First. Look, there are a lot of people, decent people there. However, we feel that there's also a lot of people surrounding Mr. Lowe who are rather strong in some of their opinions.
It's quite a light way of putting it, Gawain. I think some of the people around Restore have indulged in what I would call ethno-nationalism and politics of a Powellite variety. Now, I'm not saying Rupert Lowe has, but there's clearly some pretty unpalatable figures there who may not have had a place in Reform.
They certainly wouldn't, but absolutely not. But at the same time, there are also a lot of people. I've always said since the foundation of Restore that there are a lot of people who are very impatient with politics. I remember talking to one young man who was elected as a councillor for Reform, who has since gone to Restore, and talking to him, and he just didn't understand why we hadn't already stopped the boats. And I had to point out that it was all very well winning a council like Kent, but that doesn't have the power to actually change the weather. We have to win a general election first. There's a lot of impatience, and I think that's what Sir John was talking about appealing to young people. I think there's some truth in that. There's a sort of making the perfect the enemy of the good.
That, I'm sure that's certainly part of it, Gawain. And do you think, given what we've seen and the offers made and the long posts on Twitter, which I confess I've spent too much time reading them, do you think
You've done more than I have.
I'm not sure I believe that, but do you think, honestly, this is going to come together? So I'm going to come back to Sir John in a moment, because there is a feeling that Reform has plateaued, if not declined. I mean, in various polls, Labour have overtaken. There's some polls that have Reform over, so it's a bit of a messy picture at the moment. But if you have bled support to Restore, is it not a case of trying to put egos aside and then come together, and then your party could gain some momentum again?
I sometimes feel it might be difficult for Mr. Lowe to put an ego aside, because I'm not entirely sure what else is there. However,
that was that. I'd say that as a no. Then
there are many good people who have clustered around Mr. Lowe and Restore. We'd be only too happy to have them back. Of course we would. I think people are looking at us and going, "Oh, did you know the Restore took some votes off you?" I tell you what, if I was sitting in the headquarters of the Tory party, having been beaten by Restore both in Makerfield and across the whole of Manchester, there'd be much bigger questions to ask.
So, John, do you think that this question about whether Restore is eating some of that vote from Reform and they are responsible for that, is that fair? Because I saw, as I said, a poll of polls this morning that does look like since May's elections, Reform have been ever so slightly sliding with all those questions about Nigel Farage gifts and donations and declarations and arguing with a bin this summer.
The answer to your question is yes and no. I don't think you can blame Restore Britain for the decline in support for Reform most recently, which can be dated very, very clearly to July the 7th, and Nigel Farage's decision to respond to the allegations in the Sunday Times and elsewhere about his finances and those of his party by standing down and fighting the by-election that's currently going on in Clacton, because support for Reform was at 27%. Before that, it clearly fell to 24%. Support for Restore Britain has not risen since July the 7th. Thinking more broadly, well, of course, Reform, were for briefly in the autumn of last year just above 30%, and we're already down to 27% before its more recent travels. Restore Britain may well be part of that broader picture. And of course, what is true that although at the end of the day, I mean, Reform are clearly much the bigger entity, not just in terms of popular support, but we should remember Reform have managed to demonstrate an ability to fight virtually every council seat and every Senate and Holyrood seat in the elections at the beginning of May. In contrast, Rupert Lowe concentrated his efforts in Great Yarmouth. So Reform are now developing this nationwide organisation. Restore Britain have yet to demonstrate an ability to do that. They've demonstrated an ability to do well in particular by-elections. But of course, insofar as our politics is very fragmented, given that it's very difficult for anybody to establish a significant lead, if at the moment Restore Britain had never been invented, maybe support for Reform would be 2 points higher, and maybe therefore as a result, despite the burn and bounce, perhaps Labour and indeed Nigel Farage's current difficulties, perhaps Labour would not be having the small lead that they have. So yes, you can see why these small margins in the end might seem to be rather exaggerated, but you can also see why in the end they might be thought to be politically matter. That said, I think the interesting question is, why did Rupert Lowe decide at this point in time to decide to try and see if he can make peace with Nigel Farage?
Well, and just finally, John, while I have you here, one of the big stories that's running today is about Joshua Bonehill Payne, who's been selected to stand as a Conservative councillor in Somerset. And he has a conviction for assaulting a police officer and was jailed for 3 years for posting vile anti-Semitic material online. He's been convicted at the Old Bailey for racially aggravated harassment. Now, he's since expressed a lot of contrition for his crimes. Do you think Kemi Badenoch is going to continue to stand by? Should she continue to stand by him? And will this make any difference to her standing? Because her personal ratings have been doing quite well, and she was the most popular or least unpopular candidate to be Prime Minister. And people are wondering, is this a misstep by her?
I think the answer to Seb is that whether or who the Conservative Party decides to nominate as candidates is up to it. This person will not be the first person with some kind of criminal record to be elected to public office. The first Secretary of State is arguably in that category. And in the end of the day, of course, it's up to the voters who whether or not this person does get elected or not. And I think at the end of the day, perhaps that's where we should leave it so far as democracy is concerned.
Well, thank you very much. That was Gawain Towler, who is a board member of Reform UK, and Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde.